The little Albert experiment is one of the classic experiments of psychology undertaken by behaviorist John B. Watson and his student Rosalie Rayner in 1920 at Johns Hopkins University. In John Watson's experiment with little Albert, he demonstrated that emotional responses could be classically conditioned in humans. In other words, classical conditioning could be used to create phobias. For instance, you could condition an emotional response like fear of white rats, in this case, in humans. He also demonstrated that such conditioned emotional responses could be transferred to other stimuli, to other animals and objects, in this case, like cotton wool, rabbit, a seal fur coat, etc. Based on his detailed study on infants, John B. Watson claimed that there are only a few original emotional reaction patterns in infants. These include mainly love, rage, and fear. However, as infants grow into adults, one can witness a range of complex emotional responses establishing in them. So, how are these complex emotional responses developed in adults? The environment in which the child is brought up acts like a laboratory that helps in establishing the conditioned emotional responses in him or her. Albert B. was the 9-month-old infant on whom Watson and Rayner conducted the little Albert experiment. Albert B. was brought up in the hospital environment since birth and was a healthy and stable child. His mother was a wet nurse in the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children. Both Watson and Rayner tested the following 4 questions through the little Albert experiment. Question number 1. Can they condition fear of an animal, for instance a white rat, by presenting it visually and at the same time striking the hammer on a steel bar? At approximately 9 months of age, Watson and Rayner first exposed little Albert successively to a white rat, dog, monkey, rabbit, masks with and without hair, burning newspapers, cotton wool, etc. In this baseline test, little Albert showed no fear in any of the situations. Then, both Watson and Rayner tested the child for a loud sound. They wanted to determine if loud sound could evoke a fear response in little Albert. Thus, one of the 2 experimenters went behind the child and struck a hammer on a suspended metal bar. Little Albert showed that he did not like the noise so produced. On striking the hammer for the second time, the same thing occurred, this time with Albert's lips trembling. Finally, on striking the hammer for the third time, little Albert started crying. Thus, the noise of the hammer striking the metal bar called fear response in little Albert. Thus, the noise produced by a hammer striking the bar is an unconditioned stimulus. This is because the noise is not dependent on anything to evoke the fear response in the infant. It is alone sufficient to produce such a response. Further, the fear response evoked due to the sound alone is the unconditioned response. Now, as it became clear that Albert feared the loud sound, Watson paired the sound of the striking hammer with the visual presentation of the white rat. Therefore, each time Albert touched the white rat, one of the experimenters would simultaneously strike a hammer on the metal bar. This made Albert cry. Further, the pairing was done multiple times until little Albert feared touching the white rat even when the white rat was presented to the infant without the loud sound of the hammer striking the bar. Thus, touching the white rat became a conditioned stimulus that now evoked a conditioned response of fearing the white rat. Therefore, the conditioned stimulus, that is touching of the white rat in this case, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the noise of the metal bar being struck by the hammer, to produce the conditioned response of fearing the white rat. Question number 2. If such an emotional response is established, will it be transferred to other animals or objects? After Albert was conditioned to fear the white rat, the next thing was to test if such a conditioned emotional response could be transferred to other animals and objects. This was tested by presenting various animals and objects to the infant. These included a rabbit, a dog, a seal fur coat, cotton wool, and a Santa Claus mask. It was seen that the infant feared touching these animals and objects. Thus, it was concluded that the conditioned fear response got transferred to other stimuli like animals and objects that were related to the conditioned stimulus. Question number 3. What is the effect of time on such conditioned emotional responses? Little Albert was tested again a month later when he turned 1 year 21 days old. He was presented with a rabbit, a dog, a seal fur coat, cotton wool, and a Santa Claus mask without the noise. The intent was to see the impact of time upon the conditioned emotional responses. It was observed that the emotional responses, both conditioned directly and the ones conditioned by transfer, lasted for more than a month. However, there was some loss in the intensity of such conditioned emotional responses. According to Watson and Rayner, such conditioning had the potential to last and alter an individual's personality for life. Question number 4. What laboratory methods can be used to remove such conditioned emotional responses if they do not die out with time? Both Watson and Rayner could not research on the removal of the conditioned emotional responses. This is because both Albert and his mother left the hospital. Still, Watson and Rayner suggested certain ways in which such conditioned emotional responses could die out. Number 1. Continuous exposure to fear-evoking stimuli without pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus. This is similar to what is called extinction in conditioning. Watson and Rayner suggested that little Albert could be presented with the unconditioned stimulus, that is, the noise of the striking hammer, successively without pairing it with conditioned stimulus, the touching of the white rat in this case. This could lead to a reduction in the conditioned response. Number 2. Reconditioning by exposing Albert to feared objects paired with stimulation of erogenous zones or giving candy. Another way suggested by Watson and Rayner was that of reconditioning. They proposed that Albert could be reconditioned by exposing him to the feared objects paired with provoking erogenous zones like lips, nipples, etc. Or he could be presented with the feared objects by simultaneously feeding him candy or food. Number 3. Modeling. Modeling would include letting little Albert develop a new behavior by imitating people who were not fearful of animals. Or one could simply control his responses in respect of the feared objects, for instance, guiding his hand to touch the feared animal. Thus, through the little Albert experiment study, both Watson and Rayner concluded that number 1, emotional responses, that is fear responses in this case, could be conditioned in human beings. Number 2, such conditioned emotional responses could be transferred to other stimuli like related objects and animals. And number 3, such conditioned emotional responses lasted over a period of time. But why was the little Albert experiment unethical? No code of ethics existed for psychologists at the time Watson and Rayner undertook the little Albert study. Accordingly, certain aspects that formed part of the little Albert experiment might not be unethical at the time the experiment was undertaken. However, these are treated as ethical violations if you go by today's code of ethics. Both the American Psychological Association and the British Psychological Society have now laid down the code of ethics. All the practicing psychologists are expected to abide by this code of conduct in all situations. Some of the ethical rules that were violated while undertaking the little Albert experiment were: Number 1. Albert was harmed during the experiment, for he was classically conditioned to fear white rats, which earlier did not exist. This could also have resulted in Albert suffering for his entire life. Today, psychologists cannot harm the subject of the research. Number 2. No consent was taken from Albert's mother for undertaking the experiment. Today, psychologists need to observe the principle of informed consent. That is, they must take the consent of the person who is taken as the subject of the psychological research. Number 3. Albert or his mother did not have the right to withdraw from the experiment. Today, participants are free to pull back from the experiment without bearing any further consequences. Number 4. Psychologists are expected to maintain the highest standards of competence in their professional work. The method adopted by Watson to undertake the little Albert experiment was not of the highest standard. For instance, the experiment was not conducted in a controlled environment. Likewise, only one subject was used to draw conclusions. So these were the reasons why the experiment was unethical. Now, let's see what were the strengths and weaknesses of the little Albert experiment. The strengths were: Number 1. Classical conditioning could take place in humans. Number 2. This experiment proved useful to understand how phobias are acquired in humans. The weaknesses were: Number 1. Watson and Rayner used only one participant in the little Albert experiment. Number 2. There were doubts if such a fear response was a phobia. This is because Watson did not find any fear response in little Albert when he was allowed to suck the thumb. Thumb sucking reduced the impact of the conditioned fear. Number 3. There was no code of ethics when this experiment was undertaken in 1920. And number 4. Since little Albert and his mother left the hospital, Watson could not recondition little Albert and remove the conditioned fear. Now, is there some way the little Albert experiment could be improved? Certainly. John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner undertook the experiment at a time when there were no ethical guidelines for psychology researchers. Hence, by adopting the code of ethics formulated now, there are a number of ways in which the little Albert experiment could be improved. Number 1. By taking informed consent of the participant. Number 2. By giving the participant the right to withdraw from the experiment. Number 3. Undertaking reconditioning to remove the fear. And number 4. By causing no harm to the participant. So this was all about the little Albert experiment. If you liked our video, subscribe to our YouTube channel Zero to Eternity for more such videos on human psychology. We create videos using cartoons which make it really easy for you to understand the concepts of psychology, mental health and mental disorders. You can hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.